Well, good evening, everyone, if you're in the UK, or good morning if you're here in the United States. It's really a great pleasure to meet Eaton Collinsworth, whom I have not had the pleasure previously of speaking to. And I'm going to start by saying I've read her very brief biography in the back of this gorgeous book called What the Ermine Saw, which is what we're going to talk about. And I see that she's a former media executive and chief of staff of a global think tank.
Mhm.
Could we start over? I'm sorry. I must
No,
need more
that's all right.
coffee. Chief
No,
of staff of a global think tank
there you
and
go.
the author of 3 previous books, which are so diverse. I have to ask you, Eden, are you just coursing whatever here interests you now that you've retired?
Well, I don't, I've had the most peripatetic career. And so often is the case that I've just decided, frankly, to list my last several incarnations before I started to write, because it just sounds slightly deranged. But just to frame this in perspective, I wanted to be a painter and I moved to New York and I couldn't type. And so, which is what was required at the time. And so I was desperate to earn a living. And so I joined what was there was an irony to the name of the company. It was called Career Blazers. And it sent me to my first job, which was to become for just 2 weeks, to be the receptionist at Doubleday and Company on the executive floor. And in ways that I can't possibly begin to explain, some 8 or 9 years later, I was running a book publishing company called Arbor House. And I seem to be doing things or I've done things in 10-year tranches. So in terms of my career. So I did that before I left it to start a magazine called Buzz in Los Angeles. And I sold the magazine to Fairchild. And it happened that the corporate entity that owned Arbor House, which was the publishing house, was Hearst. And so the chairman created a role for me, invited me back to Hearst, and created a role that moved me across all the divisions. And I did that for 10 years. And during the course of those 10 years, I wrote a novel. And very much aware of the fact that I was already considered to be slightly bohemian, as a corporate executive. And I was the only, I think, one of 2 or 3 women on the executive floor. I just kept it to myself. I deliberately sent it to a friend who was an agent in San Francisco out of New York, because I didn't want, nothing was worth, frankly, jeopardizing my contract, which paid the bills. And it happened that he was moving his offices a year later, and he said to me, look, either send this back to you or we submit it. And I agreed that it should be submitted to just 3 publishers. And it happened to be over a holiday weekend. And I frankly had completely forgotten at that point you could send things as attachments rather than simply print them out and send them in the mail. And so Little Brown, the publisher, was there on a Friday, printed it out, read it over the weekend, and made an offer to publish this novel. So that's how my writing career started. But at the same time, then I left Hearst to become the chief of staff of something called the East-West Institute. And this was really off the beaten path, but I was known to be a capable manager. And although this was not my bailiwick, it was about, there were very serious issues about cybersecurity and weapons of mass destruction and so on and so forth. But at that point, I thought, well, I could, I had made all of the financial commitments to raise my son on my own, including make sure that he got through university. So all of that was put aside, and I just decided I would never have this opportunity again. So I took this position, which moved me literally around the world. There were 5 offices in 5 different international time zones. And I was never in one place at one time, but I then started to write on, on airplanes and so on and so forth. So to answer, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I'm not an expert in anything. I'm very much a generalist. But what I feel that what interests me might interest a reading public. And so that explains the diversity of my topics. So I at one point, after I left the think tank, I moved to China and this sounds completely deranged, but to write a book for Chinese on Western etiquette. And I worked with a Chinese publisher to do that. And the book was censored. So I was left in China for a longer period of time than I thought. And I took on a consulting job with this extremely, very mysterious, slightly eccentric billionaire in Guangzhou. And from that, once the book was published in China, from that, I then decided I would write a book about my experience in China, because China at that time was just emerging. And I thought perhaps it would interest other people. And then the next book I wrote was about, during the course of my living in China, it was very clear to me that my own value system was completely inapplicable. That kind of Judeo-Christian sense of fairness and right and wrong was simply not working in China, not because anything's violently different, but in fact they operate from an entirely different mindset. And so that prompted me to think, well, what about my values? Are they even applicable in my own country? And this was just as Trump was emerging. And so that was published. And from there, I have written this current book. No, from there, actually, I wrote a book on modern morality. And that prompted me, after that was published, to travel. And I ended up in Poland, which I had never been. And I saw in the museum in Krakow this incredible Leonardo portrait. And I came back to London, where I was living and currently live. I was so intrigued with it, but I was slightly taken aback that it was in this kind of single darkened room in a museum in Krakow. And so I looked into its history, and what I discovered was that it's the story of its owners was something you couldn't possibly make up in fiction. And so I thought, well, that would interest a wide range of readers. And I'm not an art expert, just as I was not an ethicist. And so I write to figure something out, or to consider something closer that has intrigued me. And I hope to bring along the readers who also are, on that same journey. So I'm hoping that explains some part of the
It certainly does. I mean, we almost have a novella right there in the answers.
I know that. I know. But at any rate, I try to simplify it, but that's the gist of it.
But what fun. And actually, that makes you the perfect person to write about somebody like Da Vinci, whom you rightly point out was a genius that probably has never really been equal, and whose curiosity and relentless quest for knowledge or exploring or whatever it is meant that he never quite completed a lot of things. For somebody of his talent, he only did a small number of paintings. Let me rephrase that. He was the person so far ahead of his time that things that I've been to his notebooks exhibitions. They were here. I've seen them here at the Phoenix Art Museum, but in other places. I have been to Milan and been to, the Sforza, to the Ducal Palace, and seen the Last Supper, which of course, is a constant state of disaster because of the nature. For those of you who don't know, it's a fresco, and because walls are subject to humidity and all kinds of other problems, trying to keep the Last Supper in any kind of preserved state is a nightmare. I've been to the Hermitage and seen their Da Vinci there, and this will make you flinch. Not only is it in a kind of ill-lit room, but it's by an open window.
I know.
The traffic is blowing in.
I know. I've seen it as well. I've seen it. But what's remarkable is that these paintings survive at all. I mean, that's kind of unfathomable, regardless of they have traveled. So, I mean, the Da Vinci and the Hermitage was obviously originally painted in Italy, and was purchased by as was often the case, because there were no art dealers, obviously, at the time, but there were diplomats who would, kind of course through Italy and realized that the noble families sometimes needed cash, and so that particular painting was purchased by I believe it was a Belgian diplomat, and made its way back to Russia, and then that family after 4 generations needed cash, and so it was purchased by the Hermitage, and with the Last Supper, I mean, that started to literally disintegrate and degrade almost immediately. I mean, he finished it and it started to, because he was a very methodical and determined artist, in addition to being a utter unqualified genius. But he wanted what he wanted, and so he used a slightly experimental type of oil-based paint that started to flake literally weeks after he had completed it, and it was always in some sort of form of catch-up, in terms of the status of trying to keep it literally on the wall. And I mean, also that that room was used as an ammunition dump, and I mean, it's just unbelievable that these things have gone through what they have and remain today. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Absolutely true. I mean, among other things, when I was in Milan, they pointed out that the Milanese lit the cathedral in the hope that bombers would avoid it. And
Yes.
they were rewarded for that, but it could certainly have gone the other way. It could have taken out, either the Allies or the Germans could have taken out the beautiful cathedral in Milan, as well as the Last Supper. And then you wouldn't probably know it, but there's a recent thriller written about the Mona Lisa and its theft in whenever it was, 1911, 1901, I can't remember which, by the guy that worked at the Louvre. But the question he raises is, because there were so many politics involved in, blame saving or blame assigning and all the rest of it, a serious question anyway is a power for the thriller about whether the Mona Lisa they recovered was actually the Mona Lisa, and whether in fact what the Louvre really has is an amazing copy and the Mona Lisa may be gone forever. And then you think about the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum and you wonder, if we'll ever know what happened to the paintings, if they still exist. I mean, there wasn't a Da Vinci involved there, thank God. But so at this point, you mentioned that only 4 portraits by Da Vinci as opposed to other kinds of work. What do you do, like 15 paintings altogether, but 4 portraits?
He did 15 paintings, many of which are not exclusively, pinned, so to speak, to his exclusively to his paintbrush. So often was the case, was he would do what is called the cartoon. He would do the drawing, he might do the face and the hands, but then he would leave some part of it to his acolytes or students. And it's the Mona Lisa is interesting. I mean, it's a combination of the fact that he was loath to actually finish anything. And then he was so completely extended beyond just painting that, he could have lived several lifetimes and he still would not have gotten to, the conclusion of many of his explorations, because there were so many. He was, he had such a disparate range. But with the Mona Lisa, that was a commission work. He just didn't, he kept on futzing with it, and he brought it with him. It was commissioned in Italy, and he brought it with him to France, his last patron. It was actually the only time he left Italy was the King of France, and he was at that point in his early 60s, and he brought this painting with him and continued to work on it most especially the smile, by the way. And it was the French king who eventually, and very few people had seen it. And it was the French king who eventually just, either purchased it or took it on. And that is why it's in the Louvre. But, there are so many kind of sidebar stories to each of his paintings. But he was more than anything driven by curiosity. And he was a terrible procrastinator. And as a result of those two things, he was broke a lot of the times, actually. I mean, and one of the reasons he ended up in Milan is that he really couldn't earn a living initially in Florence. And so he needed to move on.
Well, but don't you think, creative people, I mean, it was all a system of patronage. It wasn't like people had real jobs with real salaries. And so they were dependent upon people like the Medici or the Sforza or Francois Premier, who brought him to, I have loved going to Francois, which is his big chateau south of Paris. I'm going blank at the moment, but it'll come to me. But I've been to Chateau d'Amboise as well. And, somebody like Da Vinci was true musicians too. I mean, if you look at look at Mozart, for example, a person who also couldn't manage money and who, was dependent upon patronage, or Haydn, who moved himself to London, or however it goes. So you had a combination of Da Vinci's personality, which was really, his genius was too big for one person to manage.
Yes.
But he didn't have any one person to support and focus him. So the combination, I think, was really disastrous. But let's talk about the lady with the ermine, because this was, in fact, and requires some history of the two ducal families in Milan, which was short and not particularly edifying. I really, love visiting the ducal palace in Milan, but why don't you tell us a little bit about the three families involved?
Well, first of all, I let me take the liberty of starting with the young lady, who really was so young. She was virtually a girl, who is the subject of the portrait, and that is Cecilia Gallerina, who some speculate could have been as young as 12 or 13 at the point at which the portrait was commissioned by Ludovico Sforza, who was the Duke. Leonardo had just arrived in his court in Milan, and so this was the first painting for which he was commissioned. He did other things, by the way, and when he reached out to Ludovico was still just the regent, but because he was angling, for the ducal title, and there was a nephew involved, and there's even, the suspicion that he might have poisoned his nephew. He thought that rightfully so, that he should somehow very quickly build up a presentation that looked as though it was full of authority. And in so doing, he brought in architects and musicians, and Leonardo had heard that he was a very supportive patron who would allow him to do a variety of things. And Leonardo wrote him a letter, this very extensive letter, saying, I can build bridges, I can do sculpture, I can manage parties, I can do any number of things. And almost as a throwaway, at the end of at the end of this letter, he said, oh, and by the way, I can also paint. So at any rate, this young girl was completely extraordinary. She spoke languages, she wrote poetry, she wrote music. She was, you can see from her portrait that even at that young age, she was confident, but at the same time, very young. And she started her, the first salon in Europe. She would organize these wonderful, opportunities for mathematicians and soldiers and poets to congregate and debate. at any rate, she was from a good but not wealthy family. And the thing that I didn't realize until I started to research these families, this was at a time where Italy was not Italy as we know it today. It was the combination of city-states. And so the way that these city-states would avoid warring with one another was literally to intermarry. And so these young girls were actually educated at the level of their brothers, the girls from the good families. And they were contractually betrothed as early as 2 and 3, and then married legally at about 12. And so these families were, you always think of the Visconti family as one of the early, is quite grand. It became grand, but they all started out, as mercenaries. I mean, it was just kind of blood money, frankly.
Absolutely.
And they were completely, unapologetic. I mean, they would, kill their own family members. They would, imprison their mothers. They would do. So the Viscontis were, it was one of the very early Italian families that had organized their own armies, that actually would kind of farm themselves out as mercenaries. And it was the Sforzas who then took the next step. And as is always the case, it's like dominoes falling. So, one was there for maybe 2 or 3 generations, and then another family would show up and, and basically absorb their crest, and appropriate the castle and then build it to some other level of grandeur. So, and you're absolutely right in suggesting that whether there were musicians or artists or, geniuses on the level of Leonardo, although I believe is completely unique, they were still contracted very much like and treated very much like a, for hire. They got a signing payment that would cover their materials. They then would be given very specific, information and directions as to what they needed to do and how they did it, and everything from size and color and so on and so forth. With Leonardo arriving in Milan and the Sforza court, he was allowed to do anything he wanted to do. So that was quite honestly another reason why it was difficult for him to zero in on any particular activity. But the families would churn at a certain rate, and Italy, like many of the European countries, including Poland, by the way, where it eventually ended up, they went through the drama that Westerners can't imagine. So there is a constant pinball, activity of wars. There were inquisitions. There was the church. There were families fighting, and so the idea that anything can survive that, much less a piece of art, was always amazed me. But at any rate, it's the backdrop of Europe, in the 1400s, the 1500s, all the way up to the First World War. It was just, as I said, there was so much drama involved, frankly. So and that also, the challenge for me was to weave in enough information so the reader could find their bearings, but not inundate with dry information. And I've always been of the mind, both as a editor, a publisher, and now as a writer, that no reader is obliged to turn the page. So you must engage with the story, and along the way, without condescending or without speaking down, you then impart information that they wouldn't necessarily know. And quite honestly, I didn't know until I started to write the book.
Well, it is a large mosaic that you put together, because, you have to deal with the artist and techniques, and then you have to deal with the patron and his whole background, Visconti to Sforza. And then we have Cecilia. And unfortunately for Cecilia, who seems to really have had a decent relationship with Ludovico, even, if you never know for sure. I mean, we talk about Me Too today. Well, there was no protection for like a 12 or 13-year-old who caught the eye of a more mature and very powerful male. Anyway, it was her misfortune that he was contracted to marry a Deste, another of the three powerful families. And Beatrice, the woman, or Beatrice, whichever one it is, Beatrice we'll call her, wasn't about to put up with having her husband's mistress and child, the child that she bore him in the castle. So eventually she drove Cecilia and her son out. And, the one thing I found really sad in your book was that, here's Cecilia, whom you portray as this absolutely remarkable woman. I mean, she could have doing, salon in France in the 18th century or something, Madame de Sévigné or whatever, had nothing on her. And yet she vanishes. I mean, she just, she leaves the court and she's married off to some complacent husband, which is, very Henry VIII or whatever. We're more used to that story. And I love that sidebar there, because not only, I love Philippa Gregory's paying attention to the wrong Boleyn girl, but the truth is the only healthy child that Henry VIII had besides Elizabeth was his first bastard child with the first Boleyn girl.
That's exactly right.
If he had divorced Catherine for Mary instead of Anne, he would have actually had.
No, I know.
But I digress. Anyway, back, and there's
a total revolving door of wives.
Well, it is,
I mean, also in writing and researching the book, it was difficult. It was virtually impossible, frankly, to get any information on Cecilia after she left, because they don't even become footnotes. They, the wives, are memorialized in history books. It happened that, the court poets wrote about Cecilia, you had a sense of her, how remarkable she was. But, the thing that struck me is when you look at that painting, it's relatively small, but what comes across, even though she's not making eye contact with us, is a remarkable young woman who is not looking like a trampled flower. I promise you. She looks as though she is there you are. She is the author of her own fate. And and also I know we get into the high weeds whenever we try to discuss or compare what was transpiring at the time. I mean, you're talking about the 1490s, really, and the fact that, first of all, the life expectancy was far short. I mean, you really were middle age in your early, to mid 20s. And the fact is that young women were married, when they were still girls, really. And the idea of somehow passing judgment, a moral judgment on that, based on our moral compass or our sentiments or our opinions today, I think is wrong-minded, frankly. But that's my personal opinion. I don't think you can retroactively assign judgment, in terms of the historical timeline, when that's what was happening. And my only, if I did feel anxious for Cecilia, my solace comes in looking at her portrait, because she is very much, her own person. And he was completely in love with her, by the way, which was very much out of character. And how could you not be? She was remarkable. So, and she understood. She was the one who she was betrothed to a Visconti. And in ways that are still not understood, she was the one who annulled the contract. So she left with Ludovico, who once his wandering eye alighted on her and he decided, I'll bring her back to Milan. She was, a very much a willing participant. So I don't think of her as a victim at all, but I agree with you entirely. The fact that these remarkable women can just waft away is
See, that's
tragedy.
the inexplicable part to me. I'm not passing any moral judgment either. And I agree from what you had to say. It was probably one of those, switching to French, coup de foudre between the two of them, some kind of incredible magnetic attraction. But it seems incredible to me that somebody who had led her life just vanished like that. I mean, she could have, I mean, you wish that she had set up, some sort of salon or life or something of the sort, even if she weren't in the palace. And I find it, so I guess the question is, did she just burn out? Was she willing, to step aside with her child? And eventually she lost that husband and at least one child, I think. She
Yes.
lived quite a long time after for her
Yeah,
age.
she did. And she did continue to have salons. So in fact, when I was trying to understand what happened to this painting, when it literally disappeared from the records for 230 years, one of the rumors was that in fact, it remained in her family because it was seen by somebody who had, participated in a salon and then made his way back up to, in fact, this was Holbein, the younger, who made himself, then available in Britain for, as a court, so to speak, or the painter of kings, so, and nobility. But I mean, I don't think that she, I think she was rather philosophical about it. There are, I mean, what also is notable during the course of my researching, and I didn't realize this literally until I was kind of in the middle of the story and started to kind of, count the number of women who were involved in, quite honestly, often protecting and sometimes, saving this painting. And so they were, there were women who then were operating within the confines, which, the advantage confines of being a wife, ideally of a prince, who were incredibly well educated and I think enjoyed the Renaissance more than their husbands, who were busy defending, the castles. And there are quite a few who bubble up to the surface, including Isabel d'Estaing, who was Beatrice's sister, who, she became a remarkable art collector. She was a force with which to be reckoned. She was methodical in her, she just war gamed out her life, so that she understood how to manage all the opportunities that came with being successfully married to a prince. So, I would suggest that, as is often the case, and perhaps it still is now, alas, women can be incredibly productive if they're already situated within an advantageous marriage.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. Although, unfortunately, unfortunately for them, divorce is much easier today. And then, look at Wendy Murdoch, who, almost has literally vanished, but, briefly had a moment. But, the story of the painting, I mean, let's look at it this way. Leonardo is commissioned or, by the Duke. He has this gorgeous subject. He does this beautiful little painting, and it's pretty small and it's on wood. So it's not, like some giant piece that you have to cut out of a frame or whatever it is. It's very portable. And less fragile than if it were on canvas. Leonardo has to give it, he does deliver it, unlike the Mona Lisa. Eventually he delivers it, and now he loses it. I mean, it's gone. He's sold it, and now it falls into the hands of the people who bought it and their successors. And eventually, whatever happened to it during all these missing years, it winds up in Poland, and then various things happened to it throughout the 18th century and on up into World War II, and then enter the art robbers of all time, the worst art thieves absolutely ever, the Nazis.
Yes.
And, we've yet to recover from what they did in terms of taking art from people who owned it.
Yes.
And it's never been fully redistributed. There are legal doctrines all over. You can watch The Woman in Gold,
Yes,
or
yes,
you could read the book, or you can go
yes,
visit it up on Fifth Avenue.
yes.
That's the Klimt that has been the subject of so much. And
Mhm.
they're constantly, even today, recently, there was a whole horde of Nazi stolen art found in somewhat apartment in
Yes, no, it was,
Munich
I
or
know,
some
I mean,
guy.
it was so, I mean, that in and of itself is a story where the man, it was actually his father who had,
Yeah.
acted as the agent for Nazis, and the son, the grown son, lived reclusively in this same apartment with these masterpieces, and nobody knew about it. But I mean, it's,
How does all art survive? I guess the
no,
question
no,
is,
I mean, it's rather dispiriting because I see, since I finished writing the book, obviously the book is just out this week, but the last several months, obviously we've all been exposed to the horror of what's happening,
in the Ukraine.
yeah, in the Ukraine. And it just, I mean, history, absolutely. It's as though it's the same song but a different verse. So you see this over and over again. So when I started research, it's 1490, and I take it all the way up to as recently as the papers today. And what you see is the deliberate destruction of art in order to obliterate a culture. And so that's what has happened in Ukraine. That's what happened with the Nazis. The Nazis zeroed in on Poland, and I don't mean to use glib verbiage, but because it's just heartbreaking. But the intention was to establish a German colony in Krakow, which was the only city that was not completely decimated. Because that became the, kind of the epicenter of whatever needed to happen in an administrative way that would allow the Nazis then, Hitler, his intention was to conquer all of Europe, including Britain, by the way, which considers itself Europe. But the point is that the first thing they did was to destroy. It was not just the art, it was the libraries and maps and anything that that spoke on behalf of the history of the culture that goes way back. And I think that's the reason why Poland has been so generous, without question, in terms of the Ukrainian refugees. I mean, I started to write research and write this book during COVID lockdown, which is a fairly existential experience for me because I couldn't get into Poland, where the archives were, and I couldn't get back to Italy. However, I did, and I was on my own. And the UK had the strictest lockdown. This is why people are furious, frankly, with the Boris Johnson revelations, because everyone was incredibly cooperative and obedient. It was very strict. And so for 4 months, I didn't see anybody. I was, I had the great benefit of writing this book, which gave me a mental life. But the point I'm trying to make is that my researcher in Poland, with all her degrees, I mean, she came to me from the National Gallery. She herself is a curator. She dropped everything and went to the Polish border, 24 hours after Russia invaded the Ukraine. So, and I think that Poland, having gone through, they have an oral history of precisely that, where their culture was destroyed. It wasn't just the First World War. I mean, it was partitioned and then erased, and then it came back, and then it was, and not just the Nazis, by the way, the Russians came in. And by the way, they did take back a great many art pieces on their own. It wasn't just the art pieces being disappeared, as a result of the German looting. The Russians, in fact, they had an entire organized system, and some of those pieces are still in the Pushkin Museum.
Well, they're all over Russia. I mean, I remember in Berlin going to see the Trojan Horde, that Schliemann dug up and discovered it was, lurking in Moscow or something.
Exactly
But,
right.
I think with the Nazis, it was a combination of race and culture, but I also think a lot of it was just pure greed.
Yes.
The Taliban, I think, or the English Roundheads, there's a classic example. I mean, if nothing else, I loathe Oliver Cromwell for the unbelievable destruction that the Roundheads visited in England. And that was an attempt, that was not greed, let's take it and keep it. That was, let's destroy it.
Yes.
And the Taliban has been very much the same way. And there are other examples of it along the Silk Road and so forth. But I think with the Nazis, I think a huge amount of it was Hitler wanted to collect all this stuff and create his own version of the Louvre.
Yes.
So he could make himself look even more. And Napoleon did the same damn thing. I mean, there's a lot of art in Paris that is a result of conquest. So I think there's a difference between cultural eradication and cultural amassing, so to speak.
Yes. Well, with Hitler and Poland and this particular picture, among several others, there was literally a catalog before they invaded. So it was this incredibly well-oiled machinery. I mean, it is extraordinary. And, at the risk of sounding as though I'm making sweeping generalizations, the Germans are very organized, good at keeping lists, and they just nailed it, So they had their eye on several paintings before they invaded. But along the way, they were stealing, and in an incredibly organized way. And by the way, the people who were the enlisted were the very dignified, erudite, German museum directors and curators. I mean, people who thought of themselves as, sophisticated and civilized. And but whatever they were not stealing, they were destroying. So it was a two-prong atrocity, I think. So at any rate, I'm the only thing that I can say that gives me hope is that, under the worst conditions of inhumanity, there is still the instinct to save art. And those single, quiet acts of, heroic acts are what faces down, just abject evil. And you see that, during the course of writing this book, I was so taken by the fact that there were, for example, there was a Polish housemaid who put her life on the line, and nobody really knew about her. I found out about her through a descendant of the Czartoryski family, but she was the housemaid who was left behind. This picture, the portrait was literally entombed in a wall. And it's difficult to know whether it was the Germans or the Russians who came through, but the entire village around this estate, for all the obvious reasons, left and fled into the forests, because Hitler made it very clear, you kill any Poles, and it didn't matter who they were, you just kill them and you burn down their villages. And this, completely modest, uneducated, totally valiant and heroic woman stayed behind and saved this portrait by making sure that she's literally sewed two pillowcases together, covered it, and then hid it again because it was pulled out. And believe it or not, there was a footprint on it because the soldiers decided that, they weren't well informed enough to understand that it was hugely valuable, and they were after gold coins. And, so this was the first sweep of either Russian or Nazi soldiers coming through. But that's the hope that, one is left with, is that you are reminded that there are, very heroic individuals who make an effort to save the art, even though they might not, live to see it through.
So the painting went through the Nazis and ended up back with a Nazi. Was eventually found and currently now resides again in Poland and Krakow in the museum. So it's Odyssey across time, which is, basically 500 and some years. It's still here, and there are no real questions about its authenticity,
Oh,
as
no,
opposed to the
yeah.
possible, question about the Mona Lisa and so forth. So it's a wonderful story because this book embraces so many, sorry, I'm holding it upside down, so many different things. But you raise an interesting point to conclude on, because I've thought about this. When you're looking at great art and then you're looking at individual human life, what kind of choices do you make? And I say that because my reaction, I'm going to be stoned for saying this, but nonetheless is true. My reaction after 9/11, when those planes were flown into the buildings and so many people died and all, was to say to myself, what if they decided to just drop it on the Metropolitan Museum of Art instead? And, that is the sort of choice, because there is irreplaceable art for millennia
That's
in the
true.
Met. And
Yeah.
what if they had decided, that the better choice was to, fly a plane into the museum?
Yeah.
And I found that, that's really scary. And when you think back to some of this, you think, at what cost is it okay for people to be lost, for human beings to give up their lives or put themselves in terrible positions in order to preserve a work of art? Because the art is irreplaceable, and while the person is too, it's a different kind of replacement. I often think about that, some interesting moral dilemmas there that when we think about this kind of thing.
Well, I know, I mean, I can't remember who said it. It was Giacometti, or it was an artist who, or perhaps it was a philosopher or writer, but you would know, I'm sure, that, if you had a choice, if there was a fire, and there was a piece of art, in your house or in a building, what would you do? Would you try to drag somebody out of the building? Would you take the piece of art? And, I don't know. I mean, I think there's something slightly more visceral about killing thousands of people, because it's applicable to us all, whereas art is a more ephemeral, esoteric, entity that has incredible value, but it's lost forever. So it's I don't know. It's difficult to know even how to compare, but
I don't think you can. I'm just.
I appreciate your point. Yeah, I mean, it was Hans Frank who had this Leonardo portrait when the Allies found him. He left the castle in Krakow, which was his office and his residence, and he took with him two small paintings. One was the Leonardo, and the other one, in fact, did disappear, and that is the Raphael. And nobody to this day knows what happened to the Raphael. There's speculation that, well, maybe an American serviceman took it, and it's in an attic someplace in Indiana, or it was destroyed, because Hitler, the evil coagulation of inhumanity that he was, in his bunker, wrote one of his last official acts was to write what is called the Nero memo. And it was a memo to whoever was going to be left to blow up anything of value, including these salt mines that had stored all of this remarkable, these remarkable paintings that they had looted. And so it could have been that the Raphael was destroyed, but I guess my observation in having written this book and having lived the research, and whether or not some of it was exaggerated by the fact I was left on my own in lockdown, is that you can't, if you tell a story that's historical by way of the stories of the people involved, you are far more likely, I think, to remember the story in all its narrative arc. And that's, I mean, the stories of the people involved, you couldn't possibly make up. And it's just a reminder that, to me, at any rate, that, humanity does have the most remarkable, I don't know, patina of humanity that can be evil, but at the same time can be incredibly engaging and also, as I said, heroic. So, those were the thoughts that I was left with.
I think that's a wonderful way to end our conversation. What the Ermine Saw is a marvelous book. It's about art, it's about people, it's about history, it's about triumph, and it's about terrible things. And it has a conclusion, at least for the moment. So it's a book I definitely recommend to you. Thank you very much for joining us.